Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and we're going to be speaking about some very important movies in cinematic history today. And, I'm not talking about any of Kurosawa's films. I'm not talking about the French New Wave. I'm talking about Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's trilogy, plus the fourth one that just came out a couple years ago, Ocean's 8. The Ocean's movies, just to start off, I love these films. I love these films so much. I love these films beyond reproach. I grew up on these films. They made me appreciate not only the power of star power, really, and sort of helped me understand the behind the scenes aspect of bringing together all of these huge faces, but they also taught me what heist movies are like, and through that, how filmmaking is supposed to be. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to rank these movies in my preference. I'm going to do that really quickly for you right now. So starting off bottom, fourth place of the four. And okay, I should probably mention, I'm not counting the 1960 Rat Pack film with, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and stuff, because that movie sucks. It's like it's 60 years old now. Wasn't that great to begin with. It has 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, but don't really go off the word of Rotten Tomatoes. They get a lot of stuff wrong. Most recently, actually, they gave Bad Boys 4 70%. Sucks. Anyway, so starting off fourth place, last place, I'm going to have to give it to Ocean's 8. And before you say anything about me being a misogynist, it's just not that great of a film, to be honest. There's reasonable connections to the past. It's definitely a more feminine and different perspective of the genre in all these movies. And, I'm completely supportive of the reboot of films in a feminine or at least female gaze, especially Ghostbusters, Bridesmaids. Bridesmaids isn't a reboot, but Bridesmaids is a definite example of what these sort of female-led movies should aspire to. And I don't think Ocean's 8 meets that standard. It dragged a lot in the middle. The heist came too late. There were a couple of big twists and turns, but mostly, I don't know, it just didn't do it for me very much. Also, I'm not a big fan of Mindy Kaling, so that kind of ruined it for me as well. Anyway, number 3, I have Ocean's 13. Again, for me, this has all the elements, but it's just it's like a copy and paste of Ocean's 11 with a little higher stakes. It's another movie in the Ocean's template. It brings back old characters. It's back in Las Vegas. It just feels really reminiscent of the first film. This is the first movie that I got into in this series, to be honest. I started off with Ocean's 13, which was, I was a kid. I watched it on the TV the first time, so I don't know what to say about that, but I remember there's this one scene where the twins sort of mess with the hotel critics room. That, hands down, one of the most interesting heist scenes in all 4 movies. regardless, I don't know, there was just something about this film that it just felt too reminiscent for me to really enjoy it that much. Although there were very memorable moments. At number 2, I have Ocean's 12. Now, Ocean's 12 might be a bit scattered. It might have a bunch of plot holes and might be a little here and there, but you know what it is? It's good at what it's supposed to be. It's a film about making films. It's a film about these huge movie stars on vacation in Europe. It's a complete departure in style visually from its predecessor and its successors. It's a completely different form narratively. It's a movie about sequels. It's just so much more fun, you know, and it all sort of, the new environment, the new villains, the new chase factors, Julia Roberts playing Julia Roberts, Vincent Costello as the Night Fox, dancing through the lasers. There's so much about this film that just makes it so much more fun than any of the others, except for number 1, Ocean's 11. You know, what can I say about this movie except everything in this movie is so cool. It's so cool. But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, let's start off with Ocean's 8. So Ocean's 8 is basically the story of Debbie Ocean, Danny Ocean's sister. She's been in prison for like 5 years and a bit. And she's been planning this huge heist for the entire time that she's in prison. She knows what it's going to take. It's a team of the best people in the field, and she starts with her partner in crime, Lou Miller, played by Cate Blanchett. Together they recruit a crew of specialists, including Julia Amita, who's played by Mindy Kaling, Street Con Constance, who's played by Aquafina, Suburban Mom Tammy, who's played by Sarah Paulson, Hacker Nineball, played by Rihanna, and fashion designer Rose, played by Helena Bonham Carter. And their target is a necklace that's worth more than $150 million. So I'm going to start with the positives. All right. Essentially, I really enjoyed how this film constructed a squad of stars that each provides a new and diverse outlook of characters. So these characters, they're drawn from their actors in many ways. It allows us to relate to them with the relationships we have off of the screen with these actors. So we basically just create a persona about these characters through projection over many years based on our perceptions of these actors. It relies on us to flesh them out. And that's what I like about the film. It's a bit engaging like that. You know, additionally, you have the idea that women in Hollywood are more often than not sort of relegated to this specific type that they fit. You know, you have like the hot love interest, the quirky girl, the best friend, the girl next door. You don't really have that here because you have these 8 distinct characters with 8 distinct purposes and motivations and sort of culminations to their character arcs, despite the fact that they might not be as fleshed out as you'd want them to be. So starting off, Sandra Bullock. She plays the Danny Ocean counterpart because she's Danny Ocean's sister. The movie basically just starts off the same way Ocean's 11 does. You know, it kicks off with the same premise. She's getting out of jail. She needs to set up for the biggest heist of her life. And Bullock herself is sort of like the female equivalent of George Clooney at the end of the day. She's the relatable every woman in Hollywood. She's mastered that sense of authenticity and can't really be pigeonholed into a specific type of character. Second up, we have Cate Blanchett, who plays the Rusty equivalent, the Brad Pitt equivalent. You know, she's elusive, she's enigmatic, and just like that, Blanchett is also very mysterious, and often in a lot of her roles keeps some form of personal secret. You know, she also has this like ethereal beauty that allows her to be seen as more than human, sort of like a shapeshifter. She's got this captivating presence. And then you add that sort of strong contrast between the blonde and the brunette of Bullock and Blanchett. You know, you have the cool blonde and the relatable brunette, and that dynamic She plays that off really well, especially with the motorbike. And just like that, her and Brad Pitt also have this sort of sense of unattainability that they bring to their characters, which Brad Pitt, albeit sort of breaks in Ocean's 12, but that's a discussion for later on down the podcast. We also have Rihanna in this film, who plays this sort of basher type character, but also Livingston in terms of her job, because she's the hacker. Rihanna, like always, is this cool, irreverent cultural icon. She does everything her own way, the same way Nineball does. And you get that vibe out of this character. She's like the coolest person that isn't Cate Blanchett on this set. There's Anne Hathaway in this film. She's the star that you hate to love. She's like the female Terry Benedict in this case. Early in Anne Hathaway's career, she played the underdog, like in Princess Diaries and stuff. But now she plays the character that most people see her as, the inauthentic actor that people love to hate. The movie, it seems like this fantasy of, and the audience bringing her down, which was a very common sort of conception of her after she won the Oscar for Les Miserables. But at the end of the day, with the last twist, the movie shows us that Hathaway has this value that's overlooked, and she's a lot more fun than initially given credit for. Mindy Kaling. Now, there's no really obvious sort of counterpart for Mindy Kaling in the male Ocean's movies, but her character is very Mindy Kaling. There's the classic and quite frankly contrived and trite jokes about her Indian heritage, the domineering mother and like her wanting to get her married and all that kind of stuff. Not a big fan of that. Not a big fan of Mindy Kaling's work. But, she's known mostly for her roles as this sort of ditzy pop culture obsessed woman, but also a woman that's self-made and very capable and intelligent. And her character in that way sort of is proof that you can be both. You can be a sort of relatively feminine, but also smart, successful, intelligent, because you really can. Awkwafina plays like the Linus counterpart. Linus is the Matt Damon in the Ocean's films from the 2000s. He's the new kid on the block. He's the young starlet. Matt Damon was like Awkwafina is now this Hollywood wonder kid with superstar potential. But she also brings in the momentary zeitgeist. I hate that word. She's also the youngest in the group, just like Matt Damon was. Helena Bonham Carter plays the sort of Bernie Mac counterpart, but also a Linus character in the sense that she's the jittery, nervous... not Linus, Livingston character in the sense that she's a jittery, nervous type, the humanizing aspect of the character is the one that really brings us into the story. She's the inside person on the job. She's the most vulnerable and sensitive in the group. And it's kind of weird because, we got to know Helena Bonham Carter for her eccentric goth style, but she seems to be very underwritten in this film. We'll talk about that in a sec. Finally, there's Sarah Paulson, the wild card, the Saul character, the Carl Reiner character. She doesn't want in at the beginning, but she's also the audience's way into the heist because she's the wild card. She questions everything about the heist, and its sort of potential for success. Paulson herself is a very versatile actress, and even in this film, she plays a woman that we think we know, but is completely full of surprises. Even today, it's quite remarkable to see 8 distinct female personalities that are very distinct and sort of complex in some ways. Not necessarily very complex, but there are 8 storylines that sort of culminate in this film, which is something that we didn't get to see very often for so long. With movies like this, we're finally getting that chance. Though I will say, plot-wise, the movie sort of just lacks any big sort of sleights of hand, logical leaps. It's not like the other movies in that case. You know, there's the other movies, they're this intricate maze of knots that you have to sort of deal through. But this is a much simpler mechanical heist. You know, every problem is fixed quickly and all the characters seem to know what they're doing. Alright, let's take a quick break here and we'll be back to discuss the Ocean's trilogy a bit further.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
At the end of the day, to me, it just felt like a bad copy of Ocean's 11. You know, I went into it thinking that something would happen differently because it's an all-female cast, you know. But it's very surface level different. They decided to hold it at the biggest fashion event in the world because, you know, that's how you appeal to a female audience, right? Just proof that studios really aren't in touch with what the female... Well, I mean, I shouldn't really be saying anything because I don't think I'm in touch with what the female audience wants. But, you know, even from the first scene, she's having the exact same conversation that George Clooney did in Ocean's 11. The actors were good, and they played their characters well, but like I said, they were underwritten in most cases. Like Helena Bonham Carter's character. She's normally, like, super cool in so many other movies. But in this, she's just like an insecure mess. And it's kind of not fun to watch because at least if she was a funny insecure mess, I'm sure she could have bitten into that role a little bit more, but this just felt shallow. The story was also the same as everything before it. You know, the heist itself, again, pretty boring. It just relied on Rihanna moving a camera for like 6 days. At least the other Ocean's movies, despite the repetition, they had these intense heists and crazy action with really absurdist themes. This one was just so straightforward, and it just felt like a sort of way to get as many cameos as possible. To me, it was like they put all their bets on the all-female cast idea and didn't really put anything into anything else, you know. It's great that the cast is all female, but that shouldn't take precedence over the movie being good. Like, you can have an all-female cast and have a great movie like Bridesmaids. Because it's original, it focuses on the characters, it focuses on the story, it takes its time to develop and flesh out the storyline. There's just no core to this emotionally. It just feels like a manufactured, hollow, mechanical film that just, like an AI or like a bunch of data predicted people would like. Ocean's 13 is like, it's again, you know, like the other movies. It's lighter than air. It's pretty, it's huge, it's a goofy movie, but it's also a machine. It's a very well-oiled machine, you know. At this point, Steven Soderbergh's sort of perfected his characters and really come up with a a sort of master plan for what these movies should entail. He's come down from his own sort of huge ambitions on this film, and he works that sort of in this film. You know, when you see the screenplay from the new team members, Brian Koppelman and David Levian, the movie's fast. It makes you laugh because most of the elaborate plot just doesn't make sense most of the time. That's the absurdism that I was talking about. But even then, there are moments where it's awfully overrated. You know, it pushes the limits of what we consider sort of filmmaking at this point, because it takes your attention away from the logical bricks and focuses more on the dancing, colors and style and glitz and glamour of Las Vegas. You know, this time Danny Ocean returns to Vegas to bail out his old buddy Ruben. He pretty much just got played by a Vegas villain named Willie Bank, played by Al Pacino. Al Pacino's great in this film, you know, he's like a pint-sized Trump with really big glasses and weird orange tan. And his second in command is Abigail Sponder, played by Ellen Barkin, who makes for one of the funniest sort of... I love that sequence with her and Matt Damon. It's so funny. This movie might be the funniest in terms of absurdist humor, but when you think about it, none of it makes sense, and that's why it's so fun. But that's how everything rolls in, you know, Steve Soderbergh's Vegas. It's smooth, it's sleek, but at the end of the day, it's fun. It's glamorous, it's seductive, and you play along with whatever nonsense that you're sort of faced with. Like the first movie, they had a blackout. This third movie, they have an earthquake. But that's what it is, you know. These three movies, all of these movies, they're self-conscious tales of the glamour of movies. You know, they're like elaborate cons that sound a lot like how you get people to finance films. It's lies that sort of nurture and sustain these plans. The movies are able to sort of bewitch the audience because they exist outside of realism that Steven Soderbergh he loves to break. In the Ocean's trilogy, there's this sort of enchanted feeling, you know, where George Clooney and Brad Pitt are the luckiest hustlers in the world, and they're reminiscent of, you know, Paul Newman and Robert Redford in The Sting. They get what they want and they act like it. You watch George Clooney, Brad Pitt, Matt Damon in these films along with the other people, you know, the Don Cheadles, Andy Garcias, Bernie Mac, Carl Reiner, Casey Affleck, Scott Caan, Eddie Jameson, Shah Buchin. You realize that it's a mistake to separate Steven Soderbergh's personal visions from his film, because at the end of the day, these films are entirely personal. You know, this is, while it might seem like this is one of Steven Soderbergh's films for, you know, in the proverbial one for us, one for me, one for them, one for me, this might seem like one for them, but it's all of Steven Soderbergh's movies are for him. And despite, you know, all of this, it's what makes these movies so enjoyable. Even the very self-indulgent second movie. It's that they're not just about this obvious aesthetic investment in every single shot, but they're also about him making us love every image. You know, it finds this sort of weird sweet spot between art and audience. It takes us into a realm of just very public expression from a private one. Steven Soderbergh, he can play both inside and outside the Hollywood box. He's made movies like Solaris and Bubble, but these movies prove that he can just kill the classic inside the box Hollywood blockbuster. He knows how to bring his sort of indie sensibilities from outside the system into the system and uses it to his advantage. In these movies, he just proves that he's doing so well in the system that he tries to make fun of. And there's no movie better than Ocean's 13 to prove that. Alright, Ocean's 12. Now, Ocean's 12, it's the second movie, so after we see Danny Ocean and his crew rob 5 casinos in one night in the first film, his crew of thieves have these huge problems, because one of them is that one of the members of his gang has already spent a lot of the money that they stole. And the owner of the casinos, Terry Benedict, played by Andy Garcia, demands that Danny Ocean returns the money, plus a lot in interest. Now, because they can't come up with the cash, the entire gang is forced to pull off these further heists, but this time in Europe. Now, I'm a big fan of this film, but it has gotten a lot of criticism that I don't feel like it deserves. One of the most interesting things I've heard said about this film is from Soderbergh himself. He called it one of the largest budgeted stoner movies of all time. I think I agree. Fans weren't overall happy with the fact that it wasn't like its predecessor, which I feel like eventually became what Ocean's 13 is. Ocean's 13 became, the movie that they didn't make the second time around. And there was too much concern with the logic of the film. But, that's one of the reasons I love the film. It's so absurd. It makes no sense half the time. But other reasons I love this film. It's one of the great sequels. Because it's a sequel about a sequel. There's two villains instead of one. It's a movie that comments on what we expect from sequels. It's absurd at times, but it's just Soderbergh, because sequels are always sequels, and he understands that. It's also a star study. The first film is about the charisma of the cast. But you can see that they're all sort of individualized. That chemistry builds towards the end of the film. In this, we're already off and running because we have the first film to thank for it. This movie was post-development of that chemistry. And you also don't have to think too hard about this film because it's just a European vacation with stars. It doesn't feel desperate. It doesn't feel sweaty like other movies because despite the stakes being pretty much death for Ocean's crew, you're just having fun with them in Europe. It's like a fun hang. This film is like being with a friend. You sit down, you enjoy, you go around Europe. At the end of the whole thing, you realize that it wasn't exactly what it seemed. And, when you think about it, this is also fundamentally the best in terms of the craft of filmmaking. This movie is beautifully shot. Soderbergh, he said that in terms of filmmaking, 12 is the best of all three, because 12 is the most rewarding of all three. There's this sort of messiness, loose ends that feel like untied shoelaces. It's a more European take on these films, which comes from the setting. But it also feels like you're getting over a sense of jet lag. There's this grainy sort of zooming atmosphere. But the setting of the film and the hotel hangs, they're all like the Ocean's European vacation. The Amsterdam hour of this film is very stonery. I mean, it's Amsterdam, but also name a better movie with Amsterdam in it. I can't really think of one at the top of my head. Obviously, it's a historical city that has great prestige, but it's also a deep underbelly. It also has a very deep underbelly, which makes this the perfect setting for this film as well at the end of the day. Like I said, even though this film it seems like it's one of those one for them films, the subject of this film at the end of the day is still friendship. And Steven Soderbergh has been very open and clear about what that means to him. You know, he made a trilogy of blockbusters out of it. This film also feels like it doesn't feel like a heist like the first one did, because it's a con film. Not only is like a lot of the plot a con, but it's also conning us as an audience. But one of the most important things and distinctions in this film is that this movie uses Julia Roberts' crazy charisma unlike ever before. You know, in the first film, she's there. She's having fun. She's, she shows up in some scenes. She has some really great back and forth dialogue with Danny. But she's really just a prize to be won. In this scene, she's a part of the gang. She's the 12th in Ocean 12. This film also has a very distinct look, sound, and feel. You know, it can work as a background film because you don't have to spend too much brain power on it. But unlike the first film, which is very American, the second is so different stylistically. It feels Italian with an Americanized sensibility to it. It has that mild sadness of the expat condition, that disconnect with your home because you're so far away. There's this one shot that comes to mind of Pitt and Clooney walking past the flowers and onto the bridge in Amsterdam. You know, it's shot from behind the bridge, so the bridge sort of constrains your view. And in the shot, Clooney opens his heart and Pitt just walks away, and we sort of see them through this bridge. It's like a mockery of the beauty we expect from these vacation films. And, you know, it's just proof that Steven Soderbergh, he likes breaking the rules. He likes making the rules the butt of the joke. And that sort of playfulness comes through in this film. Again, Brad Pitt's performance in this film it's incredible. You know, he has this I'm going through a lot, but I'm still the coolest guy in this film vibe. There's a lot of freeze frame like facial expressions, you know, like when he realizes the phone is stolen. This movie made me want a Rusty spin-off, like just a Rusty movie, because I feel like that would be just one of the most fun watches, because he's such a exciting character. You know, there's that unattainability that I spoke about earlier, but he's also very vulnerable in this film, unlike the others. As well as Matt Damon. Now, Matt Damon wasn't actually supposed to do this film. He was really tired from the Bourne movies. But in this film, he brings a level of thirst. You know, there's an intentional sweatiness to his character. He's the nerd. Finally, after playing Jason Bourne in 2 movies, he's the helm of his own action franchise. But he does such a different role in this case. Now he's the nerd who sits in the back and talks about Emily Dickinson and is, you know, discluded from conversations and stuff. And, you know, finally, as I said, the chemistry of this ensemble. All of these characters, they're incredible. But the movie's also like an excuse to go on vacation with these guys. It's like an Adam Sandler movie, you know. You have Adam Sandler goes to all these exotic locations just so he can, you know, film a movie, have a good time with his guys. And that's what this movie feels like. You're on vacation with so many of these people. Like, so Steven Soderbergh got a lot of criticism for filming at Lake Como, because that's George Clooney's primary place of residence. They didn't shoot at George Clooney's house, but still, like, you know, at the end of the day, they were still on home court in some ways. And like Ocean's 11, I'm sure the actors had fun on location and stuff. Alright, let's take a quick break here, and we'll be back to discuss the Ocean's trilogy a bit further.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Alright, now, if I'm to play devil's advocate on this film, let's say a lot of the criticism is to do with the fact that on initial viewings it can seem very contrived because it's got so much meta humor about Hollywood. There's everyone seems tired in this film. There's no sort of clear motivations because, you have the Night Fox, you have Lamarck, you have Larry, you have the Rusty and Larry relationship, you have Larry looking for a father, you have the Fabergé egg, you have Andy Garcia's Benedict chasing after all of these guys. It's just a mess in that way. It's convoluted. There's too many plot lines. The house and the escrow. And then, when you end the film and you show that it was all just sort of like a bait and switch, it confuses a lot of people. But in my opinion, that's the point of this film. It's only flawed if you want to watch it and plan a heist based on it. This is a movie that asks you to suspend your disbelief. You need to before you enter the theater for this one, because it's just more fun that way. If you accept the fact that whatever's happening happens. I mean, this is in a universe where Julia Roberts exists, but no one else does. And they're all huge stars. It's just a fun film, and you have to take it in that way. People watch movies in different ways. This is a hangout movie. Don't watch it in a literal manner. Just enjoy the beauty of the filmmaking and how weird it is and how fun it is. Why should the logical aspects of the heist really matter? It's just fun. The film, it's clever, but it's self-satisfying. It's like a huge inside joke that you get to be a part of. It rewards people that like watching films about films and actors and pop culture and stuff like that. It's a big movie for me because I love all that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, it's just fascinating to watch these movie stars engage with their own personas in real time. And that's something I feel like Ocean's 8 tried to do and definitely did well with, Like I mentioned earlier on in the pod, all of the characters in some way, shape or form have a sense of their actor's personality, or at least the perceptions that we bring of those actors in their characters. Now, while that might not be because these characters are very fleshed out very well, is another concern. But at least in the original Oceans trilogy, we have these fleshed out characters. But the fact that this movie is about sequels and movies and all that kind of stuff and Hollywood in some way, that sort of personality aspect comes out, despite the fact that a lot of these people aren't the same. The tone of this film, it doesn't demand that you take it seriously like movies like Inception would. There's no grave emotional stakes at all. It's just a bunch of fun. One thing I will say though, Catherine Zeta-Jones is, she's like a weird aspect of this film. Because, there's definitely heartbreak in Rusty leaving her. There's a melancholy ending in the film due to her. And, in some ways, you could argue that her chemistry with Brad Pitt is arguably better than Clooney and Roberts. But, when you think about it, it's more because Clooney and Roberts' characters are at this different level of chemistry domestically. Their relationships are at different times and places. Julia Roberts watches or mixes paint. And Catherine Zeta-Jones is Larry and Rusty. There's a sadness to that relationship and a sense of unfinished business. I will say though, when you're in the Larry scenes, you're not in the heist scenes, you're not in the fun part of the film. And you don't care because you want to be spending time with the guys that you got to know in the first movie. She's not, despite, being one of the biggest stars at that time, she's not well served by the fact that she's pretty much alone and operating against this huge ensemble of stars with a built-in audience. Ultimately the message of this film is that we're all crooks, and that sort of seems to work out in the end of the film with Isabel being the daughter of Lamarck. But again, that's just sort of too convenient. I would like to see Isabel come back in an Ocean's 9 maybe, if they choose to do a sort of connecting plot thread. But I don't know if I want to see another Ocean's 9 if Ocean's 8 was the basis of it. I'd like to see an Ocean's 9 with a return for Steven Soderbergh. That would be really fun. Bring back that same energy, but in a female perspective. That would be really, really cool. Have Isabel come back as like a thief. We're all crooks at the end of the day, right? Back to the stuff I love about this film. Brad Pitt, again. This movie is his. This movie is about Rusty. The first movie was about Danny being the vulnerable character who had the emotional chink in his armor, in the form of Julia Roberts' Tess. Yeah, that's her name, Tess. But in this film, Rusty is the emotionally vulnerable character because of Catherine Zeta-Jones' Isabel. But this is also Damon's film because he's hilarious in this movie. But Brad Pitt, he has this incredible buzz cut. He's got that very American and Europe vibe, leather coat thing going. And it comes at a peak charisma, Brad Pitt. I guess some of the negative response to the film is probably coming from the fact that Brad Pitt, he's not being anyone else but his peak self at that time. He's the biggest star in the film and at the time, and that sort of plays off in his performance. And there's also Brad Pitt's shirts. They're fantastic. There's a gigolo bit in the film, and his clothing, you can argue that most of it is a joke. There's this one eggshell colored shiny shirt that he wears that no one but Brad Pitt could pull off. It begs the question, would you want to dress like Brad Pitt in these films? His character is like this gaudy, shady, weird character that eats all the time, but always looks immaculate doing it. I guess a lot of it comes from the fact that, he's also clearly not very happy in his life at the time, and that sort of plays into his performance as a vulnerable, more open Rusty. His life is becoming increasingly scrutinized. He didn't seem to be very happy in Troy. Mr. and Mrs. Smith messes with his personal life. And, you see all of that in his performance, which he does a really great job with. He's also clearly not very happy. Damon, originally, he didn't want to do this film, like I said. But he's the funniest part of the film. And that's because he's the only truly desperate character in this film, because he's so insecure. Soderbergh inverts Damon's naturally charismatic personality to make him into a character like Linus. And Linus, at the end of the day, keeps these characters grounded because there's already George Clooney and Brad Pitt on the cast. Someone needs to balance that. This film is also made by the chemistry between Brad Pitt and Damon. Some of the best scenes, the initial reunion, bringing the gang back together. there's the scene in the opening where Danny goes to the bank and you think that he's about to rob the bank, and that's the type of movie it's going to be, but it isn't. It decides not to rob the bank, and it becomes a more sort of fun European film rather than a continuation of the last film. Andy Garcia is also incredible in these scenes, especially when he gets to see Virgil and Turk, the twins, he gives this hilarious speech about honor and responsibility, and this very special someone that definitely will have to skip out on their wedding. And like Virgil goes through the entire table, but he stops at Scott Caan, Turk, and just plays on that chemistry. It's like you're happy to be back in the arms of someone that you already know. It's a familiarity to it. That's what makes it really funny. And adding to that, there's the scene where Rusty visits Topher Grace. Again, it's familiarity, but it's also self-awareness. It's playing around with that. There's scenes like the breaking down of the Vandervoot heist. There's... what else? The Fabergé egg heist. The Night Fox laser dance. So cool. The song playing in the background is so funny. And it just makes it so, effortless. But my favorite scene in this film is the Matsui meeting. The bar scene. Because it makes you understand. If you take that out of context and show someone who hasn't seen these movies before what this scene is, they will understand the tone of these films. In the scene, Danny, Rusty, and Linus meet Matsui. Matsui and Rusty and Danny sort of engage in this nonsensical philosophical babble. And Linus can't keep up, so he recites the lyrics to Led Zeppelin's Kashmir. What makes this scene is the pacing. Matt Damon, he's mostly silent through most of it, but you can see his discomfort through the physical performance that he gives. And that makes physical comedy. And it builds up to his reciting of the poem that gives us a cathartic laughter. Like I mentioned, Linus is this character with extreme sweatiness, and his eyes sort of glance here and there, and they make it obvious that he's trying so desperately to pull something out of the back of his head, let's say, that isn't there. And that's something, I'm quite familiar with because I do it all the time on this podcast. But you see Rusty covering his face, and you see Danny's straight deadpan look, which is the most funny thing in this whole sequence. What the scene does so well is it creates ambiguity. We don't want to be tricked again like we were in Ocean's 11. So a first-time viewer might take this entire scene so seriously that they try to figure out what the psychobabble means. But ultimately, the scene is just poking at us, as the audience. Soderbergh did to us what Rusty and Danny do to Linus. They make us insecure because we can't figure out what they're saying, and that way we work right into their hands. There's also the scene of Rusty and Danny getting drunk on red wine and watching Happy Days in Italian. It's a beautiful scene about male intimacy. It's sort of perfect, but it also shows you the limits of male intimacy because, after 5 minutes, Rusty begins bearing his soul to a very unresponsive Danny who just wants to go to sleep. But the best scene in this film is the meta scene where Bruce Willis comes to the hotel and Tess comes to her room and has to pretend that she's Julia Roberts to show Bruce Willis around somewhere or something. Alright, let's take a quick break here and we'll be back to discuss the Ocean's trilogy a bit further.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
this could have gone so wrong. It's like a scene straight out of Curb Your Enthusiasm. It's got this like really weird, sort of odd, playing your very uncomfortable version of yourself. And that's that uncontrollable, absurdist presence of this film that makes it so great. You know, movies work so hard to make audiences feel safe, and this made me so uncomfortable. I loved it. You know, you watch this and you either watch it and you think it's like so delightful, like I did, or you start knocking away at the logic and ruin the movie for yourself. You know, there's also sort of, you have to bring an extra knowledge to this film to get every joke. You know, there's Matt Damon recounting the plot of The Sixth Sense to Bruce Willis, for example, or that Julia Roberts' real husband is also named Danny. All of these sort of play into punchlines. There's a very... It just feels like an inside joke that you're a part of, you know. The moment where Damon and Roberts, they see Bruce Willis, it's incredible acting. Because, well, first of all, Julia Roberts is pretending to be a woman who's pretending to be Julia Roberts, who's greeted by one of the most famous people around, as if she's actually Julia Roberts, but isn't. If that made sense to you, congratulations, because it didn't make sense to me, but that's exactly what it is. You know, it's incredible acting because there's so many layers to it. Can you imagine having to do that? I can't. Some of the best. Apparently they went around like 23 different versions of this scene, and Willis plays it out just absolutely perfectly. Every choice that they made in this scene just works out so well. It goes so far as to, like, even the choice to have Don Cheadle, his character, correct Julia Roberts' accent, because, you know, he also came into flame for his Cockney accent because it sucks. It's so funny, it's so self-referential, it's so good. I love this film. Ocean's 12 doesn't deserve the bad rep that it has. It's so good. Finally, Ocean's 11, the best film in this series. It's about less than 24 hours into his parole from New Jersey Penitentiary. Danny Ocean, played by George Clooney, is a wry, charismatic thief who rolls out onto his next plan. He follows 3 basic rules: don't hurt anybody, don't steal from anyone who doesn't deserve it, and play the game like you've got nothing to lose. And with that, and his crew of 11, Danny orchestrates the most sophisticated and elaborate casino heist in history. Ocean's 11, as I said, is a remake of the 1960s film directed by Louis Milestone, featuring, you know, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Joey Bishop, Sammy Davis Jr., and that whole rat pack of singer actors that became huge stars. In the same way, this film was also an ensemble of A-list actors. But a lot dropped out. You know, Mark Wahlberg was supposed to take the Matt Damon role. Thank goodness he dropped out, because I don't think he'd do it justice. Mike Myers was supposed to be in the film. Ewan McGregor, Ralph Fiennes. Owen and Luke Wilson were supposed to play the twins. When they didn't work out, then the Coen brothers were cast as the twins. As much as I loved Casey Affleck and Scott Caan, I would have loved to see the other 2 options as well. Fantastic. There's some interesting trivia about the films. Don Cheadle was uncredited for his first performance in the first film because he wasn't given the same billing as the rest of his co-stars. He wanted to be like with George Clooney and like Julia Roberts and stuff. And because of that, he chose not to be billed at all. He also has the worst Cockney accent since Dick Van Dyke. Also, to get Julia Roberts on the film, George Clooney sent her a script with a $20 bill that said, "I heard you're getting 20 a picture." And because of that funny joke, she joined. Brad Pitt is also known for eating in these films, you know, and Rusty eats all the time in an immaculate fashion, I have to add. But during one scene with Julia Roberts, he ate 40 shrimp. It's a lot. That's commitment, you know, if you ask me. Also, you know, it's Vegas, so these actors were sort of given the free pass to go do whatever they want. Apparently, Brad Pitt made the most money in Vegas, but George Clooney the least. He lost the most, it seems, because apparently he lost 25 games of blackjack in a row. To me, Ocean's 11 is a perfect movie. It's perfect for what it offers. It's a movie about fun and camaraderie. There's no real big drama. It's just guys with banter trying to bring down a casino. And Steven Soderbergh's fast-paced style sort of keeps the audience engaged at all times, because it's perfect for this type of movie. You think about the opening sequence where Danny and Rusty set up Rusty's celebrity students right after he gets out of jail, and they pull off this mini heist. It's like a prologue for the film. It establishes the ease and coolness with which the movie continues. It puts down the tone of what the movie is going to be like. Soderbergh also makes pretty much one of the hardest things to do the biggest asset in this film. He makes every character in this film likable or memorable or both. Every single one of them. And there's so many of them. When you think about Danny, he's this cool, calming presence that always has the right thing to say or the perfect idea up his sleeve. Rusty is completely unfazed by everything. He's the smartest and wittiest in the room and looks great eating food all the time. Bernie Mac's character, R.I.P. Bernie Mac, he helps set up this inside sniveling world of Vegas and delivers the best moment in this movie. The Matt Damon versus Bernie Mac speech about racism, where they confuse Andy Garcia's character. It's so funny when Matt Damon is playing that Nevada Gaming Commission person. Elliot Gould is in this as Ruben. He's the perfect, tonally condescending, perfectly rich, always smoking cigar character. He has a smoking jacket. If you can't think that's the most condescending thing in the world, then I don't know what to think. The Malloy brothers, played by Scott Caan and Casey Affleck, the clearest comic relief in the film that add the perfect amount of chaos to an otherwise very slick and straight going cast. Livingston Dell, played by Eddie Jameson, is the humanizing and grounding character because he's the one who sweats all the time. We love watching him sweat it out because he's our representation on screen. I know a lot of people would look up and be like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm like a Danny Ocean, I'm like a Rusty," but honestly, we're all Livingstons at the end of the day, especially when it comes to big heists like that. Don Cheadle's Basher, despite the fact that his accent sucks, is just straight comedy. He's so funny in this film. And he gets funnier every single time. Ocean's 13, I think, is his funniest film. With the drill and the bike and everything. And finally, the actual manifestation of comedy in this film is the amazing yen. Basher's reaction, the Rusty understanding yen is easily the funniest missable detail in the film, but that whole dynamic where Rusty understands everything Yen says in Chinese is just so funny. It's so smart, but it adds to the absurdist characteristics of this film and the series. Carl Reiner's Saul Bloom is the skeptical, sort of asking the questions the audience would be asking character. When they explain the heist for the first time, Saul asks the questions we'd be asking. He's also a terrible gambler, and his being down on his luck sort of makes us appreciate him so much more. And finally, Matt Damon's Linus Caldwell. Linus is a complete wild card. He's got this clear skill in pickpocketing, but the greatest tension in the film comes from the fact that he might mess up because he's the new kid. Now that's the crew, but there's also two variables that could be sort of pins in the plan. There's Julia Roberts as Tess, the only character that can throw Danny, the debonair and perfect Danny, off of his game, as well as Terry Benedict. Terry Benedict is just an incredibly evil sounding name. That's a perfect villain name. He's got this stoic presence that can condescend everyone, except for Danny, I guess. And you just have such a hard time rooting for him. You can see just by the way he presses an elevator button that he's a terrible person. He punches it. He doesn't use his finger or anything. But it's not just the characters that make it as good as it is, you know. There's the foreshadowing. You know, we need to build an exact replica of the Bellagio vault. To practice? Something like that. And the small Royal Pine air freshener. I'm just going to say those, hoping that you get the references. The movie, it leads you to believe that Danny's fake out is just a big twist, but only to show you at the end the reveal of the heist, which is the most beautiful reveal I've ever seen. You know, I still smile every time Rusty flips off his visor. It never gets old. And then there's the music. You know, there's the Clair de Lune as the gang stands in front of the Bellagio fountain. It's a shot that captures all of these members of the 11. It's one of the great climactic moments in American cinema. The fun that's had in this movie is shared, you know, with the cast, with the audience, with all of us. And honestly, if I was only allowed to take one movie with me on a deserted island, this is the one. Because I can watch this over and over again. Anyway, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh, and take care.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.